Hey, welcome to the Best Gay Sex Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Hoppy. Today's episode is about bodily autonomy. It sounds a little heady, right? But what I'm really talking about, though, is just those zones of autonomous decision making that we take for granted. You know, those abilities to do things like to perform in drag, to seek out gender-affirming care, to terminate a woman's pregnancy, or yes, the right to seek out pleasure in ways that we find consensual, of course, but also pleasurable, enjoyable. All these things are connected and they are under attack. And that's what our guest today really helps us understand. Senthorun Raj is a professor of human rights law down under an Australian national university. I had the pleasure of interviewing him at a conference last summer, and I'm so thrilled to bring that conversation with you today because he really helps us connect those dots globally, not just to the struggle, around sexual freedom, which, as you know, I'm passionate about and, I think is critical, but to connect those dots to other ongoing struggles in the face of this global rise in fascism, I think is quite critical. So I really appreciate his astute analysis to understand what we're living through, right? This moment in time that we're experiencing where all of these private matters are under attack. And speaking of bodily autonomy, I just want to add, Sin is a fabulous drag queen. I'm going to post some pictures up here on the video and also on Instagram. If you're listening, check him out for sure, because he is fabulous and just a joy to talk to. So from drag to fascism, I think today's episode has it all. So I hope you enjoy. Sin Raj, welcome to the Best Gay Sex Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Trevor.
So situate listeners and viewers a little bit for who you are, the kind of work you do.
Sure. So I'm a academic human rights lawyer by training, who's very interested in questions around gender, race, sexuality, migration, and exploring those issues within a kind of legal context. I suppose a lot of my research comes from my own personal experiences as a kind of queer migrant growing up in Australia and sort of navigating those issues around racism and homophobia and thinking about my own emotional experiences growing up there and how that relates to broader debates around social justice and human rights. Hence now why I do the work that I do, kind of exploring these issues across a range of legal contexts and jurisdictions. So, yeah, I often live the adage, the personal is political or the personal is sexual, if you like, in thinking about a lot of these issues. Yeah, that's a little bit about myself. And, obviously I could rant for a very long time about various things about my life. But, I think that kind of distills quite simply why I do what I do and who I am.
Growing up, situate us a little bit. I always like to ask people about the sex education they experience.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, unsurprisingly, the sex education I had when I was a teenager was limited. I still remember in science, we were given a sort of extra credit project. So it wasn't even part of the curriculum at the time. Well, it was part of the curriculum, but not assessed in any meaningful way. We did a project where we researched sexually transmitted infections, chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV, and had to answer a series of questions about them. And then we basically submitted them to the teacher, and that was the extent of it. And then in physical education, PE, we also had a kind of a unit where we were talked a bit about sexual health, again, super limited, focusing on penile vaginal intercourse. So obviously erasing a lot of queer and trans experiences of sex. So it was enormously limited. Unsurprisingly, most of the sex education I have, not that I advocate this as a form of sex education, was through porn. As a curious teenager, I came to understand my own sexuality through online spaces and came to access, porn in various ways and kind of starting having conversations online with people as a way of kind of exploring my sexuality as a teenager. So for me, that was really how I possibly bloomed a little bit later in life in terms of my kind of sexual practices. But certainly that's how I learned a lot about how to have gay sex, for lack of a better word. And I do remember my first sexual experience with a guy being very complimentary about my various skills in the bedroom. And I just took heart that, clearly I paid very good attention. So I studied well and I was able to perform well on my first exam. So, which as a big nerd is really important to me. So, yeah.
And so, what do you think you learned? Like, what does porn teach us?
So at the time, it was quite stylized pornography. So this was before, for those younger listeners, perhaps before OnlyFans, XTube, amateur, pornography, people just kind of taking videos of their sexual lives in their bedrooms and uploading it for the world to see. So these were kind of, productions that you would get on VHS, obviously, and then digitized perhaps to be streamed online. At this time through very slow download speeds. So yes, exactly. So, at first it was really images and then very short videos. So again, it was a very stylized idea about gay sex that I was getting. And, at the time, a lot of the content were white guys, cis white men, very well built, kind of fulfilling a very kind of athletic kind of aesthetic.
Abercrombie and Fitch.
Yeah, exactly, the kind of Abercrombie and Fitch kind of model. And so that kind of taught me a little bit about kind of sexual repertoires around oral sex and anal sex and these kinds of things. But I suppose it didn't really give me sort of broader insights into different types of sexual subcultures and different scenes. I wasn't really exploring that heavily at the time. Obviously, I was just kind of a sort of anxious teenager as well, trying to keep my porn habits somewhat secretive from my family. And well, probably not so secretly anyway. My parents might be even listening to this right now, but hi, I'm Manapa. I will say, I grew up in a very sex positive household. So not in the necessary, like, obvious way, but my parents, and particularly my dad, is a collector of erotic Indian art. And so growing up, I was surrounded with images of nudity and bodies of various kind of genders, because in kind of Hindu culture and history, sexuality is not something to be feared. It's something to be celebrated and explored. And I remember friends would come to my house and say, Sen, do you live in a sex museum? And I used to kind of laugh because it never really occurred to me. Like, to me, it was kind of just a normal family vibe. And so in some ways, I credit my quite positive attitude towards sex and sexuality through this almost kind of subconscious dynamic that was created in my family. So again, it's not that my parents were actively sort of cultivating a kind of queer ethos as such in the home, but just these kind of less policing expressions of sexuality and even gender created an environment where I felt quite comfortable in terms of just being who I was. So even at a young age, I was very effeminate, loved being camp, still do. And so would put on heels and wear lipstick. And, to my parents' credit, they enabled all of that. Whenever I would ask my cousins or aunties for lipstick, they would give it to me. I'd walk around in my mother's heels, and I would express my femininity. And, neither of my parents said, don't do that, or punished me for it. And so I grew up with a much healthier attitude towards my own gender expression. It wasn't until I was in high school or school, really, that I began to realize that, always emulating female characters on TV or Sailor Moon, or these kind of figures that I'd come to love was a problem, because actually in the home it was kind of fine. And I never felt really shamed for it. And so again, it wasn't that my parents were actively cultivating anything in particular, but even these just kind of small actions and kind of ways of being, I think cultivated an environment where I could really just be myself and express my emerging sexuality, even though I didn't have a vocabulary to describe it. I mean, I was still very secretive around kind of the porn and the gay aspects of my life,
Mm-hmm.
but it was mostly because I wasn't really sure myself how to describe that or what I was going to identify in relation to that. All I knew is that these kind of images of, naked men aroused me, and it was something I was keen to explore because it made me feel good.
Fabulous. I love that. What is it about little gay boys and these female icons?
Oh, I mean, I could talk for ages about how, my childhood loves were like Xena and Sailor Moon and Buffy, and, the Charmed Sisters, because so much of the content I consumed as an avid watcher of television, were shows of strong female leads and kind of identifying with them and their kind of capacity to bring femininity and strength together in really creative and innovative ways. And of course, we can critique the limited kind of dynamics, the whiteness of it all and the heteronormativity and these kinds of things. But, for me as a young queer gay boy, I just remember thinking, these women are amazing. I would like to be them, when I grow up. Even today, I talk about how, Xena and Sailor Moon and these kinds of warriors fighting for justice kind of cultivated my current professional life.
Right?
And obviously, I can't, yodel or like backflip and, just walk up trees like zero. It requires zero effort. But, I use what tools I have, the skills I have in writing and reading and advocacy in order to try and make the world a slightly better place. So I owe a lot of that to these, strong female fictional leads.
I never thought about that, like a hunt for justice.
Yeah.
A lot of those shows really focus on that, like, Buffy the Vampire Slayer,
Of course.
Charmed. Oh my God, connect the dot. I feel that. That resonates with my soul a little bit. With sex education, I guess I wonder, what do you think? What does an appropriate sex education look like? And why cannot we seem to freaking get there?
I think there is a pervasive anxiety around sex that people have written about and talked about for generations. And we still see that even today, even as we see queer and trans lives increasingly celebrated, although perhaps not right now with the increasing hostility and retrenchment we're seeing, or the quote unquote backlash to a lot of this stuff. There is still a fear of kind of opening up conversations about sex, but also conversations about people's intimacies and bodies, right? Because of course, sex doesn't have to just mean penile vaginal intercourse. There are so many different expressions of sex and sexuality, different ways of exploring, eroticism, involving not just like physical body parts, but toys and technologies now increasingly obviously playing a big role, sexting, all of this kind of stuff that people are growing up with. And people are really fearful of kind of what that means, how that shapes people. And I can partly understand why. We do recognize that there's enormous, harassment and sexual violence that still takes place, and particularly against, women, queer people, trans people in different ways, and not to diminish that. But I think in our fears and anxieties around sex, we fail to realize that, young people, older people as well need education around sex, because again, a lot of people missed out on that from their youth and they still need it now. And it's about kind of confronting a lot of that shame as well that kind of underlies talking about sex. Again, none of this is new, but I think there's still a lot of those emotional kind of capacities that still underpin a lot of these conversations, and an unwillingness from a lot of our politicians to reckon with the fact that sex is a part of life and it's a part of public life. It's not just a private expression between two people, in a bedroom, as, Lord Wolfenden and others who sought to decriminalize homosexuality back in the 50s imagined. Actually, people's sex and sexuality is a feature of who they are, not just in private life, but also in public life. And even conversations about what it means to talk about sex publicly or even have sex publicly are still really taboo and challenged. And again, I'm not saying we should just have kind of, free for all in terms of how we have sex and where we have sex and how we have sex. But I think the unwillingness of people to even start some of these conversations, particularly at a political level, means that we haven't really developed a really comprehensive kind of sex education that acknowledges these emotions. Because that's the other thing I think about, is that when we talk about sex positivity and affirming people's sexual practices, that also recognizes sex being weird and awkward and uncomfortable, because that's true for a lot of us in so many of our sexual experiences. So actually a really good sex education isn't just going, sex is bad or sex is amazing. It's actually navigating all of the in-betweens, the spectrum of bad sex, unwanted sex, coerced sex, violent sex, but also awkward, weird, queer, trans, all these different types of ways of having sex. And I think we have yet to kind of reckon with how we bring those emotions, both the positive quote unquote emotions and the negative emotions, to bear in a kind of sexual education that's not just in schools, but in terms of like popular culture, in terms of the communities we inhabit, that crosses religion, that crosses people's physical, emotional states, that crosses, whether someone's disabled or not, thinking about all these different intersections. And I think we've yet to get there, but it's an ongoing project. And I see a lot of people doing this work, and it's really exciting to see that work happen. But unfortunately, with the current political environments around the world, with this increasing kind of fascistic, authoritarian move to censor queer and trans lives, it's becoming increasingly difficult to do this work.
Yeah, you mentioned, of course, the debates over trans rights. This has become this like flashpoint. What is at the heart of that?
Again, I come back to these fears and anxieties about people living their bodies and identities in ways that other people feel uncomfortable by, and I think fundamentally, as many trans people, trans scholars and queer scholars have pointed out, so many of the fears about transition, about medical care, are from people who could never imagine themselves going through that process or having those sorts of experiences or desires, or perhaps having those desires and unwilling to act on them. The story is old, right? We think about this in the context of gay life very similarly, the prohibitions on homosexuality, the need to police not just gay sex, but any kind of public expression of homosexuality in terms of, people's fears and projections of their own desires, as well as their own shame in relation to that. And I think we see that expressed in the context of trans lives as well, people living lives that feel authentic to them, going through medical, surgical processes or not, but choosing forms of transition that live gender in a way that society has not deemed appropriate or necessary. And people feel that that expression somehow challenges their own lives. And I even look to some gay and lesbian people to see how their own anti-trans politics kinds of plays out in this space. People who say that, trans men and trans women are a threat to their sexuality. And I say, how? Why is it that you define your own sexuality in terms of how others define theirs? Same with gender. Why do we define our gender or my gender in relation to another person defining it in a different way? Because, of course, we don't need to agree on what being gay means or what being trans means or what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman in order to let people live and flourish in their own lives. Because, you put a bunch of gay men in a room and ask them to say, what does it mean to be gay? You're going to get so many different answers. And, that's fine. But if we can't even agree on what it means to be gay, why are we so fixated on defining what it means to be a man or a woman as well?
Yeah, I remember back in the 90s. Oh my God, that dates me. But in the last century, there was all this sort of celebration of the idea of trans as this umbrella term.
Yeah.
And thinking about that much more capaciously than maybe now. And it's obviously dicey to kind of like, I'm not a trans person.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Neither am I yet.
I can't control that definition, but there does seem to be some consolidation of that category. How do you see examples happening around the world of resistance that inspire you around that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as we see increasing retrenchment, if you like, of LGBT rights, particularly focused around these crusades against gender ideology, as some of the right-wing population would like to phrase it, we are seeing a lot of really cool resistance. And I think about this mostly in terms of like mutual aid. So, as gender-affirming healthcare becomes increasingly difficult to access through legal means, people are supporting each other and finding ways to kind of navigate that space, finding loopholes, a bit like accessing HIV medication, in the 90s when it was difficult for so many people who didn't have the financial means or the knowledge to be able to do that. So I'm seeing mutual aid groups emerge. And I'm also seeing, people just refusing to participate in these logics of gender policing, right? So we recently had a decision by the UK Supreme Court defining under our equality legislation sex to mean biological sex, that is the sex you're assigned at birth, which has implications obviously for quote unquote single sex spaces. And suddenly the question is, well, how do you police someone's sex in a bathroom or in a space? So Are you going to ask them to flash you? Are you going to do a chromosome test? Obviously ludicrous, right? Ridiculous. It's a circus. But of course, we can disrupt that by, I saw a great post the other day, which is a badge which said, maybe I'm trans. And imagine if we all did that. Obviously, a lot of cis people doing that. Suddenly we're everywhere. And then it forces the logics to kind of crumble around because, of course, if everyone using the space might be trans, then these kind of gendered policing logics, again, fall by the wayside because they're proved to be ridiculous and ludicrous. Because, again, who gets targeted? It's people who don't look like, quote unquote, a man or a woman. But who makes those determinations, right? And so I see in even these small acts of resistance, which are quite funny in some ways, ways of refusing to participate in this increasingly, hostile environment that demands that individuals become, embedded in surveillance, right? Suddenly we have to police everyone's gender and their sexuality in a bathroom because it's not like the state is doing that. They're expecting the rest of us to do that. And we don't need to do that. So again, these sorts of acts of resistance are really, really heartening. And again, watching lots of organizations, feminist organizations, women's organizations, for example, come out and refuse to participate in this kind of divisive framing of sort of, protecting women's spaces requires us to erase trans people or to diminish trans rights and say, well, actually, in the current political environment, bodily autonomy matters for queer people, for women, for trans people, and we need to be fighting this together.
Yeah, I like the idea of making those connections across movements. That seems to be really critical, right now. Do you see any of that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Just at a kind of social movement level, there are so many groups who are doing work around anti-fascism and thinking about the increasing authoritarianism that we're seeing. So we're seeing governments around the world, the US, the UK, Australia, kind of constraining the environment to protest, making it increasingly difficult for people to gather in the streets. Ironically, the same governments that love moralizing about free speech, censoring the speech of, say, Palestinian protesters who are refusing to be silent about, the Israeli genocide in Gaza at the moment, these kinds of things. And we're also witnessing increasing policing of trans lives, refusing to make gender-affirming healthcare possible. At the same time, we see restrictions on abortion. Just here in the United States, we saw the overturning of Roe and Wade only a couple of years ago, after 50 years. So again, we're seeing groups come together, whether they're organizing around kind of decolonial movements, rights for Palestinians, rights for queer, trans people, rights for reproductive justice, recognizing that actually the enemy is similar. The enemy are these governments that are seeking to entrench a very narrow view about what it means to live in this world in the quote unquote right way, which means heterosexual, that means white, that means, conforming to very specific state logics of, responsibility and privatization and capitalism, and people going, that. And actually coming together and finding connections, even when they disagree, right? Because this is the point. It's not that we're all going to agree, we're all going to be in a kumbaya utopia, but actually saying, well, I might disagree with you on this, but thinking politically and tactically, we have a bigger enemy out there, and that's fascism. And that's really where our energy should go, not kind of fighting each other on these kind of, small points of disagreement.
Yeah, amen to that. I find that challenging, and I'm sure on the right it's challenging, but on the left, where I situate and find myself, there are often people who just if you don't believe this thing, we cannot work together, and it makes it really challenging to build coalitions. I do agree that the dots are so connected, and guess what I find hard to wrap my head around is just how in the American political context, the right is allegedly the quote-unquote party of freedom, and yet at the same time is the party that is coming for our freedom most severely and intrusively. Can you help us, can you help people understand that a little more clearly?
I think what people need to remember is that, authoritarian governments are fundamentally anti-freedoms, right? Because they seek to, entrench a very specific idea that, people need to get married, need to be a man and a woman in a particular way, need to be economically productive citizens in these particular ways. And so this kind of entrenchment of what it means to live is fundamentally about curtailing opportunities to pursue other pathways, whether that's in relation to your gender, your migration status, your sexuality, your religion, for example. Curiously, one of the differences that we are noticing more so in this particular iteration is how the language of rights has been co-opted by a lot of these right-wing authoritarian sympathizing, even if they themselves don't necessarily believe in authoritarianism, groups, because they talk about free speech, they talk about their right not to be discriminated against for holding particular beliefs, and yet what they're seeking to do is launder those rights-based arguments to censor others, right? So it's okay for me to be racist or homophobic or transphobic, but as soon as you point that out to me, you're canceling me. You're making me uncomfortable. You're hurting my feelings, right? The same people that love to moralize again that, facts don't care about your feelings or everyone is a snowflake are the most sensitive people as soon as you say to them, I think that's racist. And then the accusation of racism becomes more harmful than the actual expression of it, or homophobia or transphobia or misogyny, right? And so I think what we need to reckon with is this kind of fundamental shift perhaps in politics as we've understood it in the past to the way it's articulated now, is that some of the most authoritarian politics is being laundered under the language of rights and particularly the language of free speech. But also we see, particularly in relation to debates around gender and sexuality, around parental rights, as well as kind of, rights to religion and freedom of religion as well. So we're seeing how this kind of rights-based discourse around speech, religion, parenting is being mobilized in order to diminish the rights of queer, trans, and other people.
I mean, this is sort of a tangent, but I guess I'm wondering, do you think it's part of like that, I don't want to say the dumbing down of it all, but we don't really have a strong understanding of some of these concepts like rights. And so it's easy to subvert the discourse because, we don't really get it.
It's a really good point, Trevor. And, I'm an academic human rights lawyer, but a critical one. So I often talk critically about rights, which might seem odd, to do so in this particular context where so many rights are being kind of stripped away. But the point I like to make is that, rights have a history behind them, so when we talk about non-discrimination or rights to privacy or rights to free speech, they've been articulated in different ways and historically in ways that only privilege a very small group of people. So we've seen feminist, decolonial, critical race, queer, trans engagement with rights discourse to say, well, actually, if you're talking about healthcare, you need to talk about abortion. You need to talk about gender-affirming healthcare because those are facts of quality healthcare that matter to different groups of people who aren't always recognized or protected. Same when it comes to thinking about freedom around sex and sexuality. It's not just the right to engage in sexual practices in the privacy of a matrimonial home. It's also thinking beyond kind of marriage as the kind of locus in which relationships are recognized and validated. And so in the kind of critical discourse around rights, you begin to see that sometimes people think of rights in quite narrow terms, as you say, and quite superficially to go, well, a right to be gay is simply a right to have sex in the privacy of your own home and not to publicize it to the rest of the world. When actually, if you wanted to think more critically and more richly about the right to sexuality, you would say, well, no, because if heterosexual people are allowed to parade their sexuality in television, in films, on billboards, hold hands walking down the street, talk about their children to passing strangers, then why shouldn't we also be able to publicize our sexuality in similar kinds of ways? And so in order to engage in that conversation is to kind of engage in a more critical understanding of rights, which does involve a bit more reflection, a little bit more of social contextualization, which again, we don't really do. So people's understanding of free speech is very much, I get to say what I want whenever I want, without actually understanding how speech is actually quite limited. I mean, even the right would recognize you can't say what you want when you want, because just look at, for example, all the laws against inciting terrorism or violence. That's a fetter on speech. And of course, thinking about laws that protect people's reputation. Can't slander people, right? because, of course, to affect their economic reputation, their capacity to earn money would be ludicrous. And we can't possibly tolerate that. So, unfortunately, speech is limited in that way. But again, we never hear any of this when people talk about free speech, do we? Because these restrictions on speech are just perfectly legitimate. But of course, as soon as we start talking about, well, it's not okay to harass, abuse, humiliate, and degrade queer, trans people, racial minorities, disabled people, then suddenly it's like, oh no, you're limiting my ability to participate in a discourse. You're limiting my political expression.
Amen to that. I want to switch gears here for a minute and talk about emotions because that is so central to your work. What do emotions have to do with LGBT rights?
I mean, I think many people who are listening to this will feel some type of way about LGBT rights. So whether you're on the left or the right or however kind of you want to position yourself, the concept of rights might be something that you're hopeful about, the capacity to realize a better future. For other people, you might be kind of frustrated and angry that rights have failed, right? Like we lived in a liberal rights project. We thought we were making all this great progress. And suddenly we find ourselves in a very precarious situation yet again with our kind of freedoms being stripped away. Meanwhile, on the right, LGBT rights figures as this threat to the family, to the social order. So emotion is everywhere in every conversation about rights. And you can only start with your own self in order to understand that. A lot of my work is about kind of starting at that point about how emotions are shaping the conversations we have about rights generally, but also about LGBT rights specifically, and then thinking about how rights move, or the emotional expression of rights move from like a personal context into an institutional context. So for example, how do anxieties about gender and sexuality get institutionalized in legislation or in case law? So for example, in laws that prevent young people from accessing gender-affirming healthcare because they quote unquote might regret it in later life. So we see regret feature quite centrally and anxiety feature quite centrally in the actual mobilization and architecture of kind of a legislative ban on gender-affirming healthcare for trans youth. And so I'm interested in kind of exploring what emotions do, not just at a kind of individual level in how we respond and think about or feel, with LGBT rights, but actually what's that doing to us politically, legally, socially? And we need to confront those emotions like anxiety, shame, fear, and so on, if we want to kind of build better worlds for ourselves.
For a long time, I thought about this tension between like emotions and the law, and I see that most clearly for myself when I think about criminal sentencing and the way that criminal defendants are supposed to express like contrition or remorse. And then if they don't do that, then it can lead to like a harsher punishment. So I've always kind of felt uncomfortable a little bit, because it sort of presumes that a certain emotional state of mind would yield or should yield a different political outcome from another. And I guess what I hear you say is something like an embrace of that.
It's a great question, Trevor. And, I think when people start conversations about law and emotion, they position them as kind of opposites in a binary, right? Like emotion shouldn't be anywhere near law. We need to make rational, objective decisions. The law is, dispassionate or should be dispassionate. But of course, anyone involved in the legal system or engaged with law will know that emotions are everywhere. You can't escape them. In my work, and certainly in my recent book, I confront emotions critically. So again, I'm not saying that we need to valorize or romanticize emotions. To actually give a concrete example, so you mentioned criminal law and criminal process. There's a big push at the moment to criminalize conversion practices, or what people call conversion therapy, against LGBT people, and particularly young people, right? Because so much of the kind of conversion practices themselves rely on shame and pain, making young people in particular feel ashamed about their sexuality, feel deficient in some way, feel pained by that, and want to seek treatment, quote unquote, in order to cure or correct or suppress that in some way. And what we've seen recently, which progressives have celebrated, which I don't think is wrong, is, politicians going, that's shameful. That's horrific. So the pain and shame almost get refracted. So they move away from the young people who are experiencing the homophobia and transphobia to politicians who use their own pain and shame over the failure to do anything about these horrific practices as an impetus for criminal law reform or further law reform to ban these practices. But in doing so, it privileges yet again this idea that the criminal justice system is the best way of addressing these pernicious forms of homophobia and transphobia that cross not just kind of therapeutic or counseling or psychological context, but spiritual context, religious context, family context. And so for me, thinking about pain and shame, just in that example around the bans on conversion practices, asks us to confront pain and shame critically, not to say that this person's pain or shame is right or correct, but to see what pain and shame is doing in these particular contexts in order to shape particular possibilities for social change and legal change. And so I fundamentally think we need to challenge the pain and shame that conversion survivors deal with, because of course that's homophobia and transphobia, and we should not countenance kind of the homophobic and transphobic forms of pain and shame that many of us have had to endure. But at the same time, I caution us against kind of an uncritical embrace of pain and shame in order to launder, criminal justice politics that is going to punish the quote unquote bad people, because ultimately what that does is might make us feel better about ourselves and that we've done something, but actually doesn't get at the heart of most people's experiences of homophobia and transphobia, which is in the home, in the church, in spaces that aren't the therapist's office, which is not to say that it's not an important area to address. But if you kind of focus only on the quote unquote bad actors, you forget that conversion practices are sustained by cultures of homophobia and transphobia that take place in workplaces, in schools, in homes. And how are you going to deal with that? You can't criminalize all of that away. And so in the work that I've been doing and in my book, I kind of unpack this, and I kind of confront this idea that, to talk about emotions, including the emotions of LGBT people, is not to just celebrate them uncritically or celebrate the kind of legal avenues that these emotions have led to, but actually to think with those emotions, not just in order that we can, recognize emotions that we haven't recognized before, but also to think with those emotions, to think otherwise about law and legal politics. So, for example, how might we craft kind of social change that isn't about, fixed identities, but actually embraces fluidity or belonging, but not belonging in a kind of heteronormative way? These kinds of questions. So again, for me, it's not saying that, these emotions were right, these emotions were wrong, but actually about critiquing and reflecting on emotions in order to think differently about the future.
And I can see a little bit of that. I think in a lot of conversations I have with young people on the left, where on the one hand, they want to end mass incarceration, but like on the other, if you present any social problem, many of their first impulses will be to criminalize it.
Of course.
Whatever that thing is, they don't like it. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know that we can do both of those things, but emotion seems to be at the heart of that impulse. And so I see a lot of that. What is emotion? It's almost like a revenge.
Yes, retribution. Yeah.
Retribution. It's like we're living in.
I mean, resentment is pervasive. And I say that as someone who feels resentful a lot of the time. I think this is something that I think we all really need to be honest about, is our capacities for resentment and retribution are wide ranging. And I think we need to be really careful. And I don't just mean, look, on the right, because we see this materialize politically right now. We're seeing how, fascist resentments are being used to crush, women's rights, trans rights, queer rights, migration. We see the language of gender ideology and illegals being used to quash entire communities and trash entire communities. So we see that public resentment playing out in politics. And, we see that very clearly. But also, even in the quote unquote left spaces or the spaces we might be familiar with, we also understandably feel resentful towards that, right? And our exclusions. And perhaps to individuals who don't fully get everything, to individuals who might be curious or sympathetic or don't fully understand why we're as angry as we are. And we resent them for not being as angry as we are, right? And I think that's quite dangerous in some ways to the politics of solidarity, because we do need to be compassionate, including to those we disagree with, and perhaps to those who might wish us not harm, but who might not see us fully as ourselves just yet, but have the capacity to do so. So this is not an excuse to say that we need to sympathize with Nazis or fascists, because that is not at all the politics I'm trying to kind of espouse here. But at the same time, our logics of retribution to punish those who hurt us, I think are quite palpable. I know I felt it. When I see people talk about my communities, my family, my friends in ways that are horrific, that are abusive, I just want to return that sense of resentment back. I want to feel that, yeah, exactly. I want to, feel that retribution, and it might make me feel good in that moment. but it's not going to achieve a politics of justice. And I think we all have to confront the resentment that we feel, not just perhaps to the kind of fascistic governments and the kind of political environments we're inhabiting at the moment, but perhaps to each other as well, and kind of think more carefully and critically about how we build communities and how we, as I read recently, kill the cop within ourselves, right? Or at least try and diminish the inner fascist within us, because we all have the capacity to be fascistic in some way.
Amen. Absolutely. We have to look inward. And before we look outward, in some ways, I feel like I've been trying to look at that because I feel like deeply that there's this emotional thing, this anger, this resentment, as you say, and it can lead you to really not great places, not to build healthy coalitions, but to tear them down. Ugh, yeah, it's just not productive places. So I feel that. Let's talk about another emotion.
Sure.
People often say that pleasure is an act of resistance. What does that mean?
I mean, it's such a great question, isn't it? And, there's so many ways of thinking about pleasure, and pleasure can be resistance, in a world that demands productivity, that, even where sex has to be productive, result in reproduction and kind of, certain kinds of social life or gendered life, then actually having fun, not necessarily even through genital sex, but through other kinds of sexual activity and expression, and finding pleasures perhaps in non-sexual activity as well, can be hugely resistant. Thinking about, doing nothing. It can be deeply pleasurable. I know I feel, my afternoons, as my partner and I will attest, me sat on the couch, binging a series on Netflix, usually a trashy reality show, while he plays the PlayStation 5 in his game room, and we both kind of whittle away the time and just embrace the pleasure of it all without the sense of productivity. And it's kind of wonderful, and it's kind of an act of resistance in a world that constantly demands everything we do is productive. And, as a quote unquote overachiever, as my friends and family constantly remind me, I feel it quite acutely that actually pleasure is sometimes difficult to do as well. I think for some people, and, there's really rich histories about pleasure. But again, I'm not saying that pleasure is going to lead to political transformation and that we can all just have fun and avoid fascism, because I don't think that's true. And I think, we need to have difficult conversations, uncomfortable conversations. So not everything we do is going to be pleasurable. But at the same time, what sustains us as people, what sustains our relationships, what sustains a lot of our communities is pleasure. And I think we need to recognize and live and revel in that it's okay to have fun, that it's okay to enjoy life, because what is the alternative? The world is shit. There's fascism thriving in so many places around the world. We're witnessing genocides in various parts of the world. It is shit, and we need to be real and truthful about that. But we also need to be able to confront that, and in different ways, and also to continue living and building a world where we can live and love with one another, because that's the world we want to live. So we need to prefigure that, and we need to move towards it.
Amen. I mean, at least for this podcast, at least speaking for myself, is a way to find pleasure in a time of panic and crisis, because we need it. I mean, but I even feel more apologetic for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where you do nothing. Like I've got a little Raspberry Pi with all the old games of it, playing like the Super Nintendo games. It's like you almost have to be sick to feel justified doing that. Like, oh, I had a cold. I could do that. But otherwise it's like, oh, people demand that productivity. So I appreciate that. I want to talk about sex. Like how can sex be an act of resistance? I want to hone in on that idea a little bit more specifically.
Yeah, I mean, look, in a world in which certain forms of sex and sexuality are policed and punished, just having sex and refusing to subscribe to that is resistance, right? It's a little bit like, the adage is like, if, gay sex is thought of as criminal, sinful, disgusting, then embracing that and having that is you to the rest of the world, right? And so I think that's still the case in many places. And so I think being willing to do that is an act of resistance. I mean, you risk a lot. If you think of resistance as risking something, then having sex in certain ways, particularly where you're criminalized because you're gay or queer or trans, and you want to engage in sexual practices that are deemed quote unquote immoral or sinful, then immediately your willingness to engage in that is risky and is going to be resisting, right? And so I think there is still real scope for sex as resistance. But at the same time, I also caution some of my friends, not so much friends, acquaintances perhaps, or people I come into contact with, not to over romanticize the idea that sex is the only type of resistance and that, just going to bathhouses constantly or having a lot of sex is somehow changing the social order of the world, because we need to do a lot more than just our way out of it.
Yeah, hello. Yeah. It is true. A membership at Steamworks will not set us free, but it does do something. It does have some value as resistance, but from a broader kind of cultural perspective. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope? My friends, my family, the communities that I'm a part of. I'm constantly inspired, energized, yes, frustrated, but hopeful about the things I see them doing, whether that's organizing mutual aid groups, whether that's throwing pride parties, whether that's engaging in various kinds of sexual activity, to come back to the pleasure point. They're building and curating spaces for ourselves and for each other, and for strangers, opening up their homes to house people who are displaced, whether that's people displaced locally because of homophobia, transphobia, or economic precarity, lack of housing, abuse, or people who have fled persecution elsewhere and are seeking refuge in a new country, and they're trying to do work in order to support them. I see hope in all these kind of interpersonal acts of belonging, of friendship, of compassion, of solidarity. And so for me, that's what gives me hope in a world and in a time perhaps where hope might feel like a resource or a luxury that people don't have access to. And, that to me is what keeps me going in the work that I do.
I mean, for me, it's been drag shows.
Oh, absolutely. And, as someone who does drag in a very crude and amateur sense, that also brings me enormous joy. And, just on a personal level, being able to march at various prides and putting on my lipstick and my glitter and, being able to kind of parade myself down and take photos and feel fabulous just feels wonderful. And being in a community of people where I can do that just feels so energizing.
Amen. I love that. And we will definitely be putting some pictures up of you and your fabulous outfits.
Oh, yeah. Plenty.
It is true. You have style. Yes. I love the glitter of it all. So thank you for bringing that joy to the world, because I think it's necessary. What can people do today? Like, what can they other than go to Steamworks, what are the things that we can do to find joy, but also maybe resist? What are the tactics that you're telling people, this is how you can get involved and make a difference now?
A few things. I think people should just start with a sense of humility and curiosity about the world. What is it that you're curious about or don't fully understand? Because that's the thing. You don't have to fully understand something in order to support it, right? Or to recognize that other people feel differently and might want to pursue a life different to you. And I think enabling individual people's curiosity and humility to recognize that's okay is actually a really important starting point for so many conversations, because you don't need to have all the answers. I know I don't. And, speaking on that front, in a time where information is everywhere, it can feel like if you do care about the world, that you're just overwhelmed, that there's so much to pay attention to, because there is. Suddenly the world opens up and all the moments of crisis, the moments of inequality, the wars, the conflicts, they feel so immediate, and it will destroy you if you don't allow yourself room to breathe, to engage, to build community. And so for me, in order to engage sustainably with activism, find your people. Get involved with communities locally, because I think that's so important. It's not just the online worlds that we inhabit, because we can be too online, and I say that as someone who is very online. It is the local communities and physical spaces I have access to, and the people I speak to and have fun with, who ground me and who give me the kind of energy, joy, and drive in order to continue the work that I'm doing. And so find local community groups, mutual aid groups, perhaps, that you can join, get involved in, because you can make change locally, as I like to say to people. I've been involved with Amnesty International for many, many years. And that's the heart of so much of what it does, is all about kind of local organizing. Yes, we should change laws and policies, and we need to work towards big political and social transformation, but we can do a lot of work and healing work within the spaces we immediately occupy. And we can do that with humility, with curiosity, with care. And we don't need to know everything. So I don't say to people, go read 50 books or go pay attention to everything, because you can't. And if you try to, you'll exhaust yourself and you'll then stop engaging. And that's the worst thing you can do right now, is to stop engaging.
Yeah, amen. And I mean, when I say drag shows, I mean not literally, but also like I go to these there have been these Friday night RuPaul watch parties, right? And I love RuPaul. I love seeing the drag, but also like it's kind of like a Cheers, There's a television show in the 80s.
Yeah. I know Cheers.
Yeah, it's like where everybody knows your name, I could go by myself, and I know that I'll see multiple people there that I know. Like, I know it's just a sense of community. And I really haven't felt that in a long time. So it's given me a lot of joy, hope, all these positive emotions. We really need to charge our batteries, with right now. So I love the community. Invest in your community.
Absolutely.
I always like to end with a segment I call Sordid Lives and Untold Tales for short. What's the sluttiest thing you ever did?
So many things could be classed as slutty. So I suppose finding a hierarchy of that is challenging for someone like myself. But one thing that does pop to mind, actually quite recent, it was last year. I was in LA. So I was there for LA Pride. And I was on Grindr, and a guy messaged me and said, would you be interested in some nude photos? And I said, oh, okay. I've never done that before. I've taken selfies, sure, but like I've never done a nude photo shoot. A lot of it, yeah, and a lot of it has to do with my own insecurities that we all have about, our bodies and all of that. But, this guy seemed nice and very approachable. And so I said, you know what? Why not? So I rocked up to his place, and yeah, he made me feel very comfortable. Took photos of me with clothes on, without clothes on. And honestly, I felt so liberated. And it was kind of amazing because growing up, I used to think, wow, that's so slutty. Like, having someone take naked photos of you and like, how could people do that? This is like young Sen, right? Like thinking about all these kind of social taboos. And here I was as an adult kind of breaking them and feeling kind of amazing about it. I remember texting my boyfriend afterwards being like, that felt amazing and like so liberating. And, we had sex afterwards as well. So it was kind of like, oh, this was slutty in all kinds of ways. And I really liked that. And I got amazing photos as a result of that, which I now use in my profiles. And honestly, I get such great comments from people, and and they were in black and white. So obviously giving the kind of artistic kind of flair to them. Right. And I just kind of loved it. And, yeah. And, nowadays nude photos are hardly some sort of taboo. We all have them and they kind of circulate ubiquitously online. But I think having someone kind of take photos of me somewhat semi-professionally and then, send them to me, I sort of felt that was just kind of really slutty, but not necessarily in a, having sex way, but in a way that young me just never would have imagined doing. And that to me was really quite slutty. And I kind of loved it when I left.
Yes, I live. Oh, a boudoir photo shoot. Yeah, we all have those selfies for sure. But having a photographer do it, wow, that's a great experience. And I guess free of charge. If people want to find out more about you, where can they find you?
You can find me on Blue Sky. It's just my first name, Senthorun, Senthorun, on Blue Sky Social. And also Instagram, because I have a very unusual Tamil name. I love it because I can use my first name for literally everything and it's never taken. So it's all my social media handles is just my first name. So find me on various things.
That is fabulous. Well, Sen, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. It's been so much fun. Thanks, Trevor.
That's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening, as always. It really is a pleasure to bring this to you. I know this episode is a little delayed, and if you're an active listener or subscriber, thank you so much. And I apologize for the delay. It's just, life's been busy. So I'm going to get these out as fast as I can. Got some great content coming your way. Thanks for listening. Subscribe if you haven't already, and see you on the flip.